Are you seeing the rise in entrepreneurs using podcasting to grow their business? And maybe you wonder how to host or guest on a podcast in a way that will help you generate authority-boosting content that attracts your ideal client. Or maybe you're looking for a way to stand out and optimize your podcasting efforts to skyrocket your ROI. I'm Lindsay Phillips, host of Leverage Your Podcast Show, where I bring insider secrets from podcast industry experts, including myself, who have created a successful online business through podcasting. So join me every Wednesday morning as we drop a new episode, sharing tips, tools, and strategies that cover all parts of podcasting, from launching to editing, from guesting to speaking, to lead conversion and monetizing so you can leverage podcasting for your business. Head to leverageyourpodcastshow.com to start listening.
Welcome to Beyond the Microphone, a podcast about podcasters and the stories of how their shows came together, grew, and what they discovered along the way. I'm your host, Adam Baruh. So, as we get into our interview today, I thought it would be really good to talk about vulnerability because, a lot of you guys, podcasters who are listening, you got into this work in podcasting because you had a story to tell. And oftentimes that story, like mine that I'm about to share, it's not a good story. It's not a fun story. It's a story, and I think the powerful, part of it is the vulnerability. I mean, when, podcasting is such a really powerful and unique communication method, medium, whatever it may be. It's so powerful because, I find that the stories that people tell, the way that they're opening up and being authentic and being vulnerable, it's pretty unique. Like you often don't find it in other forms of broadcasting. But something about podcasting, it's considered to be a safe space to be vulnerable, to tell a painful story. And, the point is that by doing so, we're trying to help others. Through the power of our own experiences and our own stories, good, bad, ugly, whatever the stories may be, people listening will find connection. They will, find relatability. Often when the stories themselves are really painful, you can feel alone and for years suffer in this kind of silent suffering because you feel alone and you feel like there's too much shame wrapped into the sharing and the telling of the story. But really the healing power in it by being vulnerable and opening up. I mean, this is why I love being in the podcasting spaces. I got into it with my first podcast, The Change, based on a really painful story that I had overcome and found my way through and via. And so I thought, and this is not the first time I've told the story, and I'm going to really just kind of briefly sum it up so we can get into our interview today. But, I thought it might be pretty relevant to tell my story. Again, I've told it on other podcasts, but, I think our guest here today is going to relate to it, and probably many people in the audience have similar stories or experiences that kind of launched into their, becoming a podcast host. So this was a Friday night back in early 2021 after about a year and a half of suffering from extremely terrible anxiety attacks, which I first ever encountered for the very first time starting in late 2019. So here I am, late 2019. I was 46 years old at the time. Just all of a sudden, and I attribute a lot of it to the fact that, I was 46, and it was like, I think my nervous system had just not been able to contain the narrative, and it was manifesting as anxiety attacks. I'm running an IT consulting company with 20 employees. My fourth kid was recently born, and I'm really not sleeping, and I'm overworked, and hence anxiety attacks. So that was late 2019. So now back to, kind of early, getting into mid 2021. Here I am. It's a Friday night. I had just earlier in the day had my second session with an executive coach that I had recently hired by the name of Kristen Taylor, who's my dear friend now. And it's midnight and the house is quiet and everybody's asleep, and I just turned off the blacklist. No, this is not a story about Raymond Reddington. So I turn off the TV and it's really quiet in my house. And a memory from earlier in the day from my conversation with Kristen had kind of cropped back up in my mind. It was a conversation about shame versus guilt. And when Kristen asked me earlier in the day, I had brought up, how I had gotten divorced. This was several years earlier, but I had a divorce and I have 2 older kids, and I just was telling Kristen how I was still feeling all these negative, guilty emotions around the divorce and the impact I could see that had on my older kids. And Kristen just asked a very simple question that literally changed my life. Adam, do you think you feel shame or do you think you feel guilt? I don't know, Kristen. What's the difference, And she explained it. So now it's midnight later that day, and I'm kind of remembering that earlier conversation, and I just kind of, in my mind, just voiced a question like, is there something I do feel shameful for in my life? And it was literally, as soon as I voiced that thought, my higher self, spirit, whatever it may be, said he's ready to process this. And so immediately I flashed back to when I was 6 years old and my parents had gotten recently divorced or split up. I don't think they were divorced yet, but my mom would hire this teenage babysitter boy to come over and watch me so she can go out. And, after 2 or 3 times of babysitting me, he decided, it would be fun to just lock this kid in my mom's walk-in closet and I'll invite all my friends over and have a big party. And so that's what he did. I mean, he barricaded the door in my mom's walk-in closet, barricaded me in there. It's pitch black dark. I'm 6 years old, terrified, terrorized, okay? And, I would be in there for hours and ultimately would get let out. And there, he's got a bunch of friends over. They're all doing pretty hardcore drugs. I remember rubber hoses and needles, which I didn't know at the time, but, they were probably doing heroin and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And they thought, a couple of times after letting me out that it would be funny to molest me. So while I never blocked out that memory, I never blocked it out. I went about and really honestly and weirdly never thought that it had any impact on my life. I don't know why I had that belief system, but the belief system that was developed at that time was built around shame, because as a 6-year-old, and probably to just try to, my, early childhood psyche was, trying to find a way to give me some level of power or authority versus helplessness in that moment. Like, I think a belief system was developed that I caused it. It was my fault. And that was the narrative that played out in the belief system my entire life. So going back to that Friday evening, once I literally had this revelation that changed my life, I realized right away that no, I was a victim, and that's when my healing journey began. And my podcasting life grew out of that. A couple months later, I decided to host a podcast. I never thought I was going to do that ever. But again, going back to vulnerability, I definitely recognized that here I had, as a business leader, an opportunity to vulnerably and authentically tell my story openly and publicly in hopes that it would heal others and also kind of normalize the conversation around mental health. And so with that, let's go ahead and introduce our guest here today. Her name is Lisa Tickel, and she is a childhood abuse survivor and host of the upcoming podcast, Healing and Growing Hand in Hand. Hey, Lisa, welcome to Beyond the Microphone.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited.
Good. And, I don't know a whole lot about your story, but just the fact that you had a painful childhood that, however much you want to get into it is completely up to you. But what I would like to understand is how the knowledge of that, or the narrative and the belief system, how that all culminated into ultimately finding your way into podcasting and wanting to host a podcast, and by doing so through vulnerability and your own authenticity, find a way to help others who are suffering.
Right. Well, I actually started my healing journey when I was 19, and I'm going to be 60 this month. So it's been a while.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. And so, with that, there wasn't much then to help people, right? So it's been a long journey. And so much of, I think a bulk of my healing's really been the last 5 or 6 years, especially over the last year. And over the last year, I've been able to put the whole story together. And what came out of that, which I was told this for years, I even told this to myself, was it wasn't my fault. The childhood abuse wasn't my fault. I knew it in my head, but I didn't know it in my heart. And I finally got that in my heart. And so in all of this as well, I didn't have a voice. I lost my voice very young. So I'll tell a little bit about my story, just so you have an overview of it. I will be telling my entire story on my first episode, so you'll hear more about it. I don't get too much into the actual abuse itself. What I get into more is how it affected me and then how I healed. And so my abuse started as far back as I can remember. And it was my parents and my brother. And it was physical, emotional, and verbal abuse. And so what happened is because it happened at such a young age, as far back as I can remember, I never had a safe place. And I didn't have, and anytime I was vulnerable, as you were mentioning, you brought up so many good points in your story. The vulnerability would be used against me. It would be used as a, something to take advantage of, really. And so with that, of course, comes the shame, like you mentioned, and the shame. And I love that you mentioned the difference between shame and guilt. And in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, there's no good thing in shame. And anybody who's had any kind of abuse carries that. And I carried that for years. And I carried for years living in survival mode. Living in survival mode until about the last 5 or 6 years. And so, like I said, my healing journey started at 19. And over last year, what has come together is really the whole story of my parents. Because, abuse is usually generational. It's usually carried on. And so learning more about their background and what happened with them helps me understand my journey and helps me forgive them and work through that. That's been huge. That's been really huge. I knew a lot about my dad. I knew nothing about my mom. And I learned over the last 2 years. And it's been really interesting.
Hey there, fellow podcasters. This is Tori Barker of the Creative Visionaries Podcast, and I'm excited to introduce you to Podtask, the all-in-one platform designed to streamline your workflow and take your show to the next level. If you're tired of feeling overwhelmed by the tasks required to manage your podcast, then check out Podtask, where you can easily streamline your podcasting process and simplify your workflow. Say goodbye to the stress of managing multiple tasks and deadlines, and hello to a more efficient and productive podcasting experience. And it doesn't just stop there. Podtask also offers AI-based marketing tools that give your podcast a competitive edge. As a fellow podcaster, I know from experience how important it is to have a reliable and efficient tool like Podtask to keep you on track. It helps save me so much time in post-production, which allows me to focus on what really matters, creating great content for my listeners. So if you're ready to take your podcast to the next level, head over to podtask.com and sign up for a free forever plan and get started today.
I want to go back to something that you said, that I'm curious about the story of how this kind of manifested. So you mentioned that you knew in your head, but not in your heart, that you were not to blame for what happened. Tell us more about that journey. Like, what kind of led to your revelation that, like, where you now are accepting this into your heart, that you were not to blame for what happened?
You know, it's really interesting. It actually happened over the last 6 months, really. And it happened in therapy. So I am doing EMDR. And in that, what the biggest thing for me, like I said earlier, I didn't have a voice. And so what I was doing, I was going back to some of these moments where I felt completely powerless, right? Completely powerless. And, you know, so often you hear about people, you know, you need to address the little girl in you or the little boy in you and help them. And that's exactly what I did. I came alongside little Lisa and spoke on her behalf. And it was the first person in her life that really stood up for her. And she was completely safe. And so the first time I experienced that in my therapy, it was really empowering. And it was probably the second or third time that we went into it and I, you know, stood up for little Lisa, that I just felt in my heart, it like came together and I really understood, oh, this really isn't my fault. This really, because big Lisa had a conversation with the abusers. And it wasn't, you did it. It wasn't that. It was having a conversation and really having a voice and not being angry. There were no tears. It was power behind my voice.
I love that. And EMDR, for those of you who kind of picked up on that acronym, it's basically a form of trauma therapy that also I utilized as I was kind of working through my stuff. And, you know, it's a lot of like, you kind of follow, you know, your finger, or there's tapping techniques. There's some different techniques, but it's a way to kind of like retrain your nervous system in dealing with stored trauma. And, you know, actually something, and I'm really happy that we're kind of in this day and age where you are starting to see really well-known celebrities and people kind of like talking about their own stories. And I think just, again, that's going back to vulnerability and the power of podcasting in this form of a medium. It's like, it's a way to kind of collectively like share in each other's experiences to find, you know, our own inclusion and to really, you know, stop feeling so alone. And so Prince Harry, you know, I forget the name of his series with his wife, but he was talking about, you know, as a young child, shortly after his mother, you know, died. I believe that was in France, that where her car accident was, Princess Diana. And so he couldn't travel to Paris anymore without being triggered. And I think as an adult, he found his way to EMDR, and so he had the benefit of learning EMDR techniques, and so he would be flying now into Paris subsequently and using EMDR to basically have the triggers to stop the trigger. And it was very effective. And just, again, by him kind of sharing vulnerably, you know, his story and his experience, it helps us all, it normalizes it. And it really helps us all kind of have a shared knowledge that, you know, we all are suffering from something one way or another, whether it's, you know, something current, something stored from the past, but, you know, that's it. I mean, especially through the pandemic. I mean, we all kind of suffered through a global traumatic experience. And, you know, you said something else that I thought was very fascinating, and I think is a very kind of comparison with where we're at here in mid-2023, and that's just the idea of vulnerability. So, you know, it was hard for me being, I don't know, I'll just say in my own opinion, being a man, you know, kind of being a Gen Xer and kind of coming up in the IT industry in my career, and it wasn't normal to talk vulnerably about painful things. And, you know, as I became the CEO of my company, you know, I had a lot of imposter syndrome. I definitely, to show vulnerability as a business leader is to show weakness, or so the narrative went. And, it wasn't the right time. And, one thing I'm grateful to the pandemic for is I do think it kind of, very much in the popular culture, with people talking about mental health, now it's become something that we can discuss. So, tell me a little bit from your perspective. You have this kind of notion that, with vulnerability, that that there's weakness there, that it's a negative thing to be vulnerable. Like, what's that journey been like for you to get to the point here today where vulnerability perhaps is your superpower?
That's a really good point, and I got a lot of thoughts going through my head. But one of them is that, I used to care so much about what everybody thought, because again, going back to the abuse, I was worried about how I looked because it could be used against me. And again, vulnerability was used against me, and it's exhausting. It is absolutely exhausting to hold that up and to try to hold up the facade that, no, everything is just fine. I'm great, And now, what I also know, what I learned, one of the things I'll go back on real quick is when I had done a workshop for childhood abuse healing. It was called Childhood Abuse Healing Workshop for Women. And in there, the very first night, we would have all the women share one story, the first story that comes to their mind. And in that, there was just so much that would come from that. Number one, it would create a connection among the women, because you'd be surprised how many women never shared their story, or a little bit. So it created a connection, and it broke that lie of, "Ooh, I'm all alone in this." All of a sudden, it's like, "Oh, you dealt with that too." So there was a connection, there was a bond, and there was a vulnerability, right? And so that, to me, is where I began to see healing in people, and as well as in myself, is when I finally put down the charades, I call them, and I just, first of all, people don't have the right to make fun of me anymore either, right? So I'm self-empowered. And so I know in that vulnerable moment is where healing can begin, or it can grow. It doesn't mean it's not uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that when I'm in that vulnerable moment, when I'm sharing something really, scary for me, it doesn't mean that I'm not shaking and I'm, trembling, but I'm going to say it because I know there's power in that. And there is also power when you expose shame. You get your power back when you speak out something that is causing shame in you, which is also vulnerable, right? It disempowers that shame.
Yeah. And it's really a belief system, and it's a narrative. Correct. And that's really all that is, because, for me, it did go from my kryptonite to becoming my superpower, and probably for you too, and for others. I mean, I think that's, when you get to the point, especially here now and where we're at in 2023, it's just, I think that when we can come together and find how much we are actually alike, I mean, it's really, there's so much division right now, and it's been just pervasive the last several years. And, I think we forget how similar actually we all are, how, through empathy, we can kind of put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and think, you know what, like, well, here's a really brief story. Okay. So my wife and I used to be wedding photographers. Okay. And I remember this one wedding, which we were super excited about. I mean, this couple, we kind of fell in love with this couple, and we were actually hanging out with this couple and, becoming friends with them. And then, we get to the wedding, and it was like a beautiful venue, and it was a beautiful day. But we had this wedding planner who, look, I get the wedding planner's perspective. Like, they also have a responsibility to make sure the day goes well, and they have their own way of thinking and experience on how that's supposed to be, right? And, I'll just make this statement, for people in the wedding industry, give the wedding planners their space, because, they it's a stressful day for everybody. But long story short, this wedding planner was getting really, like, on a harassment level with my wife and I, who, look, we had like many years of experience. We also knew what we needed to do to make the day go well. But this wedding planner was like literally relentless on top of us. I mean, to the point where we couldn't even sit down or use the bathroom or like eat, because she was just like, anytime we were not photographing, we were like, avoiding our clients. Anyway, so like it got confrontational. We kept it private, but like we had to tell the wedding planner she needed to back off, right? So we can do our job. And anyway, at the end of the evening, often when everything's wrapped up, that's the time my wife and I would usually kind of sit back, maybe have a glass of wine. And so
Pressure's
the wedding planner, so the wedding planner came around and she sat with us, and first thing is she apologized to us. She said, "I'm so sorry. I just really been stressed out all day, and I know I wasn't really kind of acting myself, and I know you guys were doing your job. My son's going through open heart surgery tomorrow, and I can't deal with it." And it's like, that the power of empathy in that moment for her to vulnerably share what she was dealing with. It really, like, the first thing that I thought about was like, how much I kind of need to check in with myself from time to time, because I was getting pissed off and, mad at her, but, she shared her story. She vulnerably opened up and shared with us what was going on. And then, we had a great conversation after that.
Yeah, you never know what someone else is going through, right?
Never know.
There's a really powerful video on my website, Healing and Growing Hand-in-Hand Podcast.com, that talks about this very thing. It is a powerful video that I posted on my Facebook, I don't know, 10 plus years ago, and it went around the world. It was powerful.
Okay.
And it speaks on that very thing.
So let's go back to, kind of like this work now that you mentioned you've been on a healing journey since 19, but it was really only this year that everything kind of started to align and make sense. Let's go back there to now this transition. Well, first of all, what were you doing? Like, what do you do kind of, in your normal life outside of this now work that you're going to be embarking on that is your healing journey for others? Like, tell us about that transition from whatever you've been doing to now making, having this calling to podcasting and healing work. Like, tell me a little bit about that journey.
Well, I'll tell you, and I think you're going to agree with this, that to me, the most important thing in order to really begin your healing journey is self-awareness, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that has been the biggest key for me, is just the self-awareness, like for triggers, for instance, I'm aware of now when I'm triggered, and I understand it, and I can diffuse it, right? And so, so much of that is I try to keep present. I try to keep, slow down, because I tend to move really fast, and just be self-aware and take a deep breath. And I have such a different view on life than I used to. And there's so much more freedom in me, and joy and peace. And I do everything I can to protect it, which means I'm careful about the things I listen to. I'm careful about the things I talk about. I do my meditation. I listen to good music. I dance. I do a lot of things that I didn't do. I used to do a lot of self-medicating with food or with just shutting down, right? Closing down. And now, because the journey I've also been on is discovering myself, because I didn't know who I was. And so I've been on that journey. And so I stretch myself. I make myself do stuff that I probably wouldn't normally do and get uncomfortable. And it's not that uncomfortable, actually.
Yeah. When
you finally push yourself to do something, it's not that hard.
I couldn't agree more, and that echoes very much my journey. And in fact, I listen to this podcast. I haven't in a while, but I always, when I listen to it, I love it. It's I forget the name of it. I think it's called Awakening OD by Jessa Reed. And she's a comedian, but she also is very vulnerable and open with her own story. And so she talks about a lot of the healing stuff. And I remember when I started my healing work, it took a while. I would say it took a good 1.5 to 2 years to really kind of get to the place where I am now, where I have I can harness that self-awareness and be in control of it too, because I guess what took a long time after I started my healing journey is not really knowing how to like communicate to like my wife or others, like I need my space right now, and I need to like take care of my mental health, right? Mm-hmm. Now I know how to have that conversation, but it was like, for that period where I was really trying to figure it all out, I did become very overprotective of myself, like, because I'm like, well, I know my journey that I'm on, and nobody can touch it now because it's for me, it's beautiful. It's like, but anyway, getting back to the Jessa Reed thing, I remember one of the challenges that she put out there to her audience was like, hey, in terms of like looking at like what fills your cup or recharges your battery, sit down with a journal. I challenge everybody to do this. Sit down with a journal and a pen and write down 5 things that fill your cup. So let me ask you, Lisa, if I put you on that challenge right now to sit down with your journal and write down 5 things that recharge Lisa and fill your cup, could you very quickly name those things? Compared to maybe a year ago, would you have been able to do that?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. No, a year ago, because like you said, the self-awareness, of understanding, like, it was really interesting when you were saying that, like, you didn't know how to articulate to your family or to your wife, you needed that time. And I totally can relate to that, because your head starts spinning and you get anxious, right? And you're like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know. And now it's like, oh no, now I know what it is. Right. And so, yeah, I could definitely come up with, off the top of my head, spending time with my family.
Yeah.
That rejuvenates me. My grandchildren. Actually spending time by myself rejuvenates me. Dancing. I love dancing. And it gets all that stuff out of you too, Mm-hmm. So yeah, I could definitely come up with 5. Where before, no.
Yeah.
It certainly wouldn't be the same answers.
Yeah, I remember like when I actually did that challenge, it was kind of like we were in Cape Cod where my wife's parents live, and this was a day there was a bunch of people coming over, and it was going to be a fun day, and the weather was nice, and I had built up some resentment because I still hadn't gotten to the point where I was an effective communicator, and so things would build up, and I build resentment, and I had been kind of like watching my kids a lot over this vacation, and I just wasn't talking to my wife like also about what my needs were. And I remember this kind of blew up in kind of like an argument, and I was just like, look, I'm going to the beach. I'll see you guys later, and so I got to the beach and I was listening to this Jessa Reed, and anyway, I kind of sat down after she put that challenge out there. I couldn't think of a single thing. It took me a long time to think about what does refill my cup, because I was so like, because I had this narrative of negative self-talk and shame, I became a people pleaser, and I've been a father since I was 26 years old. So my oldest is now almost 24, and everything in my life has been dedicated to everybody else. And so where did that leave me? It left me with not knowing what made me happy, right? Mm-hmm. So fortunately, through things like mindfulness, which it sounds like a lot of what you're describing with the self-awareness, like, can be wrapped up just with this concept of mindfulness. And it's really, mindfulness, self-awareness, whatever you call it, there's so much powerful, like, perspective when it comes to just looking within and kind of becoming very present in the moment, where you can identify the triggers, because they were happening in me for 46 years, I was a 6-year-old. So 40 years, up to the point where, now I'm having these anxiety attacks. And at the time, not knowing at all why.
Right.
I mean, if I look back now, I'm like, duh. Like, I had a traumatic experience as a 6-year-old getting locked in a dark closet for hours at a time. Now I'm having claustrophobic anxiety attacks. Duh. I don't know why I couldn't. It took me to being 46 years old to figure out, where those anxiety attacks were coming from. And then, now this other thing, a belief system around shame. Okay. So what are some of the mindfulness techniques, if you've used any? For me, it was like Tara Brach's RAIN method was a really useful tool. But are there tools or things that you could speak of that, you go back to in those moments that kind of bring you back to self-awareness?
Yeah, breathing is a big thing for me. Breathing and slowing down. And what came to mind is when I'm triggered. And you touched on that, right? And so you didn't know for 40 years why you were being triggered, and same here. And I didn't understand triggers. And I just a couple weeks ago, we were out of town and I got triggered. And it was so interesting because it was the first time really that I slowed way down, took a deep breath, and analyzed what was happening as it was happening. And it made no sense, the things that were going through my mind. It made no sense, the things that were coming out of my mouth. And as it's coming out of my mouth, I'm thinking, what are you saying? What are you thinking, right? And then I realized, I'm triggered. And I turned to my husband because I'm saying all this stuff to him, right? And he is one of my safe places for sure. Probably one of my first safe places. And so I'm saying this stuff, but it's, there's shame as I'm saying this stuff, right? Because I'm thinking, this doesn't feel like me. And I stopped and I looked at him. I said, I am clearly being triggered. Clearly. Because this makes no sense. It's going through my mind. And it makes no sense what I'm saying to you. And he just smiled at me. And I said, you know what? We're not going to do that thing that I keep saying we're going to do. We're going to do something different that's healthier. And so for me, the self-awareness, and when I realized too, I have anxiety, right? Of course I do. I didn't know it for years.
Yeah.
Breathing helps me because it helps me slow down because I tend to move too fast.
Yeah.
And so the breathing, because I have to focus on my breathing and I have to slow myself down so that I can sort it out and make the right choice or make a better choice than what I would when I'm upset or triggered or whatever it is.
I'm hoping that kind of, and I really have a lot of optimism for it because I just am in love with millennials and Gen Z and kind of a lot of what those generations are bringing to the forefront of like what's important. And, so they're all of, in my experience and my perception, I think those younger generations are really like, they get it. I mean, I think they, partly because like as they were growing up, like getting back to the slowing down thing, like as a society, we've been living too long with this fast pace, got to achieve, got to knock things off my task list. And you get to a point where that bubbles up to the point where your nervous system can't take it anymore. And it will culminate in anxiety attacks or triggers or whatever. But what I see happening with the younger generations is definitely the dialogue around mental health and people's mental health needs. The identification that I've seen, and it's, the Great Resignation, I think, was something that encapsulated this, where, people in their work lives said, I'm fed up with this grind, and I'm going to do the work because I need a paycheck, and I'm going to make sure that, I'm doing work that's fulfilling, but I'm also going to live this life that fulfills me. And so, I think what I see is just an appreciation for, road tripping or spending time with friends. And anyway, so it gives me a lot
life.
It gives me a lot of optimism for the future and my younger kids and hoping that they're not going to, they won't even know, or perhaps they'll read about how there used to be this like belief system around just work, do. But, that, hopefully gets to a point where that's all in the past now. So, as we kind of start to get into a close here today, couple of questions. So since you're not podcasting yet, I normally ask 2 questions to everybody, but I'll kind of change up the first one. So,
okay.
I guess I'll ask this way. As you've been working to take this idea of a podcast from concept to reality, and you're kind of learning the inner workings of just being a podcaster and what that all encompasses, what are some of the discoveries that you've made about podcasting that you find to be striking or relevant in your journey?
For the number one is having a voice. I didn't have a voice. I didn't have a voice all my life, and my voice would literally get stuck. And so having a voice is huge for me, and the ability to, as I put it, shorten other people's pain, if I can help them shorten their pain. And it's just been it's been exciting. It's been really exciting. Yeah. I don't know if I really answered your question, did I?
No,
Say
that
it again.
you did. That's
I did,
good.
okay.
So there's a part 2 to this question, and it's
Okay.
definitely, so I think, with part 1, you already kind of went inward. Let's go a little deeper now. In terms of your thus far, just, going from, where you were before to this idea of wanting to become a podcast host, to use your story and your experience and your voice, as you just mentioned, to try to help others. What discoveries have you made personally about yourself that maybe you weren't aware about before that now you know about?
Ooh, that's a good question, because there's been so many discoveries over the last year. That's a good question. There's been a few. That I'm stronger than I thought I was. I always knew that I was strong, but knowing how strong I am, that I am sharing my story, that I'm willing to be vulnerable, because that's new to me. As far as, I always thought I was an open book, but I'm realizing now in doing my research and doing my podcast that I wasn't. I was very quiet. I didn't share my story. I had a best friend who's been here visiting, and she's known me since I was 15, so she's been around, right? And I asked her, I said, Teresa, did I ever share my story? And she said, no, you never shared your story. You never shared. She said she knew something was going on, and she witnessed some of it, but she said, no, you never shared your story. And so now, being vulnerable is okay. It really is.
Yeah, those are beautiful words to close with, and I couldn't agree more. And, I think very much I'm thankful and grateful for you for being on here today, and, for people that are using the power of podcasting and for being vulnerable to really help others. It's, just to see how podcasting can be used as this platform to help others. For me, it's been an honor to be on this journey, and it's an honor to be a part of seeing others that are also doing the work to help others. So thanks for being here today, Lisa.
Thank you, Adam, for letting me have a voice here as well. I really appreciate it.
Lisa Tickel is a childhood abuse survivor who's been on her healing journey since she was 19. She's had the privilege of co-facilitating a workshop for women healing from their childhood abuse. She's the host of the upcoming podcast, Healing and Growing Hand in Hand, where she will share her story to help give hope to others suffering from abuse and trauma. The podcast will include experts and provide valuable tips and tools for healing and growing. If you're enjoying Beyond the Microphone, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening, as well as to our YouTube channel. You can find links to all of these in our episode show notes. If you're looking for help and guidance in your own podcasting journey, I'd love to help out and give you a voice where you can find direction and, basically create that format for getting your story out there. So if you have passion and purpose that are behind your own podcasting journey, come find me on eiqmediallc.com, and I'd love to help you take that passion and purpose in podcasting to the next level. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time on Beyond the Microphone.
Beyond the Microphone is produced and distributed by EIQ Media Group, LLC. Elevate your emotional IQ with podcasts and content focused on entrepreneurship, overcoming adversity, stories of emotional courage, women's health, aging, and more.